Sup gamers, Baragon301 here, and lately my life has been kind of boring because of this whole quarantine thing. I've been confined to my house where all I can do is watch monster movies and play Bass Pro Shops The Hunt. So what better way to spice things up than to get an angry mob on my porch and a bounty on my head? I'm going to be talking about a very controversial topic in the Godzilla community, that of course being the Heisei Godzilla series. The Heisei Godzilla series is a series of 7 films released between the years of 1984 to 1995 and is by far one of the most popular Godzilla series. It's also one of the worst. I can already smell the smoke. Now before the Heisei fanboys write their angry comment then leave, I'll go over why the series as a whole is bad, then get into each film individually. So the main problem with the Heisei Godzilla series is that the characters are bad, the stories are bad, and the kaiju fights are bad. And you kinda need all those things if you want to have a good kaiju movie. Now what are some good things about the series? Well, the music's good, the kaiju look cool, but really that's not that important, and plus just about every other Godzilla movie can do all those things just as well. Now let's get started by taking a look at the first Godzilla movie in the Heisei series that was technically released during the Showa era, The Return of Godzilla. For Godzilla's 30th anniversary, Toho decided to bring him back with a reboot that would ignore all the films prior except the original. This film was going to be darker, and Godzilla was going to be set as the villain again. Now before I really get started, I should probably mention that I'm watching the Kraken release and not the American re-edit. So what do I think of it? It's alright. Now I know this is a fan favorite, and I respect it a lot more than most of the other Heisei films, but it's just got so many problems. It's got some good stuff. The attack on the Russian sub is a phenomenal scene. When Godzilla is revealed, he has some fantastic destruction scenes, and the debates between Japan, Russia, and America are great too. My problem is, though, that basically everything else isn't good. For starters, the characters are pretty boring. You have a generic scientist, his assistant dude who's the most soulless one here, his sister, and Goromaki, a reporter I only remember the name of because he's named after a better character from a better movie. No, the other Goromaki. That's the one. They do feel a bit more involved and important when compared to the other Heisei casts, but when looking at casts across the entire series, the Return of Godzilla pales in comparison. But you're not here for the characters, are you? What about the monster action? Well, it's pretty good, but there's too much of it. First 1/3 of the film is great because Godzilla's there, but he hasn't appeared yet. This is basically why the submarine scene is so good, but sadly this is the only time something like this happens because immediately after Godzilla becomes front and center for the rest of the movie. Once he appears in Japan, he never leaves, and it quickly makes Godzilla's presence diminished since he's always on screen. The Return of Godzilla is a film that I want to like, but it just has too many problems, and it keeps it from being one of my favorites, though I still think it's better than most of the other Heisei Godzilla films. So what is my favorite Heisei Godzilla movie? It's obviously Godzilla vs. Biollante. Godzilla vs. Biollante was actually spawned from a contest Toho held to let fans write the script, and one of these scripts ended up being Godzilla vs. Biollante, and one of the other ones ended up as Gunhead. Shinichiro Kobayashi was the one who submitted the script for Godzilla vs. Biollante, and prior he had helped write an episode of The Return of Ultraman with basically the exact same plot. Now what's so great about Biollante? Well, everything. The characters in this film are easily the best of the Heisei series, and some of the best in the franchise. Now not all of them are great, but there are definitely some good ones, like Dr. Shiragami, Gondo, that Surabian agent again, and Miki Sagusa. Miki would then proceed to appear in every Heisei Godzilla film after this one, in usually pointless roles, but here she's actually important. The story is actually pretty good, though they are basically juggling 3 different plots all at once. You've got Shiragami making Biollante, the military fighting Godzilla, and trying to get Godzilla's cells back from that Surabian agent again. They do a decent job and they all tie in together well enough. It's certainly not perfect, but it's not bad. But what about the kaiju, at least a few of you are asking? Well, they are easily the best in the Heisei series. 2 fights we get are short and brutal, a bit beam spammy, but not as bad as later entries. This film also has some of the best effects in the entire franchise. Biollante is an impressive beast, and even though she's a giant plant, she moves more than every suit and puppet that appears in the next 5 films. Godzilla vs. Biollante isn't a perfect film, but it's the only Heisei Godzilla film that I'd actually consider legitimately good. While Godzilla vs. Biollante is easily the best Heisei Godzilla film, it bombed at the box office, and Toho had two theories as to why. One was that Biollante was a new kaiju, and people just don't recognize it. The other was that Back to the Future 2 killed it. So, of course, their next film was Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. Now if I ask, what's the most insane Godzilla movie? Most would probably say Adora or maybe even Planet Eater. But those movies don't cause your brain to implode by thinking about them too much. Now if you want to survive watching Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, you have to shut your brain off, or else the plot will literally overload your brain. Or you'll realize that it promotes World War II Japan. Now what do I think about it? Well, it's certainly the best of the 90s Godzilla films, but it's got a lot of problems, like it's messy. Oh, sorry, I think my brain almost imploded. Anyways, this film's responsible for shifting the Heisei series from its more serious tones into being more of a fantasy series, and just keeps getting weirder. Weirder than the Showa series sometimes. Oh yeah, and it promotes Imperial Era Japan and has distasteful war reenactments. But hey, at least the characters are decent. Honestly, the characters are the one thing that gives King Ghidorah the advantage over the other 90s films. The main cast is decent, and it's really the main villains that steal the show. The kaiju stuff is alright. It sets in motion a lot of the Heisei series plagues, but it still has some decent moments during the fights. Mecha King Adora is cool, and while he really can't move, he does set in place a pretty big plot point that would help create the giant mechs of the future movies. While Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah is certainly a bad movie, as long as you don't think about it too much, it's a pretty fun time. Since Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah was such a big success, Toho decided to continue bringing back more past popular kaiju, and so for the next film we got, conclusion to the Heisei Godzilla series, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2. Now this movie gets a lot of hate, but for a while it was one of my favorite Godzilla movies. Though after recent rewatches, I've kind of started to see a lot of the problems with it. I still think it's one of the better Heisei Godzilla movies, but that's not saying much. The characters aren't anything special. Heck, the main dude is pretty annoying. But they do serve the story well, and they do have their charming moments. And holy crap! A Heisei movie after Biollante where Miki actually feels relevant to the plot! Anyways, the effects aren't great and are typical Heisei fare. The suits are stiff, slow, and look about as convincing as Hanzagiran's salamander puppet. The fights are pretty beam spammy once again, but I think it kind of works here. You have to remember what the original Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla is like. Mechagodzilla just stands there and shoots missiles and beams. Now that scene is still more impressive because of the insane pyrotechnics and real explosions, but even then Mechagodzilla 2's fights at least make a bit more sense. But at the same time, Godzilla just stands there during the fights, just taking the lasers. Plus, the fight at the start of the movie is pretty decent, though Rodan's puppet is incredibly stiff. Stiffer than the giant claws. Oh well, at least Godzilla blowing up Mechagodzilla is pretty cool. Oh, and the music in this film is great. Alright. Adding that one to the list of monster movies with good soundtracks. Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2 was supposed to be the conclusion to the Heisei series, but afterwards Toho decided to make another one, so they rushed out Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla. Now this is a movie that even most Heisei fans will admit is pretty bad. Now the characters aren't actually terrible. The main guy who's trying to kill Godzilla is actually a pretty interesting character, though everybody else kind of falls a bit flat. The biggest problem with the film is the story. It just has too many ideas and subplots that are all clashing together, and it just doesn't do a good job of balancing them like Godzilla vs. Biollante. The plot is literally the military is trying to stop Godzilla, but have too many ideas on how to do it. Oh, and then Space Godzilla just shows up. There's even a subplot about one of the main characters betraying them and being part of the Japanese mafia, but that plot is basically resolved like halfway through and nothing comes of it again. But what about the kaiju? I hear more of you Heisei fanboys yelling. Well, they all look pretty cool, but as with all the other 90s Godzilla films, the suits are too big, bulky, and stiff. Space Godzilla's floating effects in particular are very bad. The fights in this are very spammy, though I can't deny there are some interesting moments, but ultimately the bad effects and terrible story ruin this one. Also, Miki's powers that she seemingly just makes up are stupid. Welp, All the doors and windows have been boarded up, and I'm ready to talk about Godzilla vs. Destroya. If I had to pick a Godzilla movie that I consider the most overrated, it'd definitely be this one. To start off, the story and characters are pretty decent at the beginning. A lot of interesting stuff is set up, and then the kaiju show up. Yeah, it's very similar to Space Godzilla, in that it sets up a lot of things that end up going nowhere. Only this time the characters are all abandoned with the plot points. Once Destroya shows up, they all basically disappear. Oh, but you're not here for them, are you? You're just here for the monsters. Well, kids, say it with me now. The suits are too big, bulky, and stiff. It's the exact same thing as all the other films. And as cool as the kaiju look, this is definitely the effects of the 90s films at some of their worst. The fights are still pretty bad. Godzilla and Destroya do get into some physical combat, but it basically amounts to a giant bumping contest, while the cameraman tries to recreate the giant condor fight. Then after that, Destroya just goes through all of his abilities one at a time like a laundry list. Okay, so for the fight scenes, I need you to use all of Destroya's abilities that I've got listed in the script. Fine. Alright, what are they? Okay, so first Destroya shoots a purple beam from his mouth. That, of course, is his main attack. Alright, so spam it. Then he has this grabby hand on the end of his tail, which he uses to drag Godzilla around. Okay. He also has this super cool horn beam. Oh, and he can also change form and even split into lots of little crab dudes. Alright, sounds hard to do, but I'll see what I can do. The fight is just Destroya slowly going through each of his abilities one at a time in order to fill up a Wikipedia article. There's absolutely no flow, and once he uses an ability, he never uses it again, aside from his beam. It ultimately creates a boring and anticlimactic fight scene that drags on for over half the runtime. But what about Godzilla and Jr.'s death scene? Well, I guess it's sad the first time you see it when you're like 5 or 6, but like, Godzilla 98 does the exact same thing, and I don't see anybody giving that film any praise. At least that film has a fun cast. I think my biggest problem with Destroya, though, is just how much praise it gets. Even mainstream critics love this film, when really, there's no substance here. It has some interesting ideas, but they're all pushed to the side for a long and boring fight scene. So those are my thoughts on the Heisei Godzilla films. And if you enjoy them as fun popcorn films, then I'm right there with you. But if you truly love these films, then I think you at least need to see some of their flaws and understand why others might not care for them as much. I hope you all walk away from this video with at least a more critical view of these films. You see, you need to be able to see these films' flaws. That way, if you ever go into storytelling, you don't repeat their mistakes. Like a certain other film. Now if you'll excuse me, I have to go deal with an angry mob outside my house. I hope I see you all again next time.